September 15th, 1812. A crimson, ominous glow rises over the ancient capital, obscuring the stars. The heat is so unbearable that the glass panes on the Kremlin walls, where a short man in a simple gray coat stands motionless, crackle and burst. He gazes at the ocean of fire, greedily devouring wooden structures, merchant warehouses, boyar palaces, and the golden domes of churches. In his eyes, usually cold and piercing, is reflected not just the conflagration of a vast city, but the collapse of the greatest illusion of his entire life. A man accustomed to dictating his unyielding will to kings, redrawing the maps of continents with a stroke of a pen, and decreeing the fates of entire nations, for the first time encountered a force he could not mathematically calculate. He expected the keys to the city on a velvet cushion, a solemn deputation of boyars, submission dictated by the age-old laws of civilized warfare. Instead, he received empty, echoing streets and a torch thrown into the powder keg of his own exorbitant ambition. At this moment, amidst the deafening crackle of burning beams and suffocating smoke, the fate of the world seemed to hang in the balance. The Emperor of the French, the master of Europe, stood face to face not with an enemy army that could be defeated by maneuver, but with an unfathomable, irrational element that would forever change the course of history. But to understand how he found himself on this stone balcony in the heart of a foreign, burning country, one must rewind time to the rocky shores of a distant island where, to the sound of the surf, this incredible odyssey began. The story of this dizzying ascent begins not in the gilded halls of Versailles, nor in the shadow of Parisian cathedrals, but in a dusty, harsh province. Corsica, this wild island, having just come under the rule of the French crown, seethed with hatred and discontent. It was here, in the family of an impoverished nobleman who barely made ends meet, that a boy was born whose name would soon become synonymous with both absolute greatness and boundless terror. Young Napoleon Bonaparte was neither French by blood nor by spirit. He grew up with a feeling of deep, burning resentment for his small homeland, dreaming of the day when Corsica would cast off the hated foreign yoke. This feeling of alienation, of otherness, would become his first and most important teacher. When a 10-year-old boy is sent to military school in Brienne, he finds himself in an icy vacuum of complete solitude. Poor French, a strange, guttural accent, poverty, and wounded pride make him an outcast among the pampered offspring of wealthy aristocrats. They mock him, but it is this isolation that hardens his character, turning him into steel. While other cadets dance, fence for fun, and amuse themselves, he avidly devours books. Plutarch, Caesar, Alexander the Great become his only loyal friends and interlocutors. In the cold, damp walls of the academy, clenching his fists in powerless rage at the taunts of his classmates, he learns the main rule of his life. The power of intellect and unyielding will can crush any birthright privileges, any walls built by tradition. The world around him was changing rapidly, as if sensing the approaching storm. Old Europe was cracking at the seams. The Great French Revolution became the volcano whose eruption destroyed age-old social elevators, opening the way for talents from below. For a young, ambitious artillery officer, this was a once-in-a-millennium chance. Chaos demanded order, and the young republic desperately needed a vengeful sword. The siege of Toulon became the first act of his public drama. It was there, in pouring rain, knee-deep in mud, under the whistling of English cannonballs, that Captain Bonaparte showed everyone that war is not a beautiful parade, but a rigid geometry and precise, ruthless calculation. He personally positioned batteries, slept on the damp ground next to ordinary soldiers, and took a city that was considered impregnable. This was the first spark. But the real, all-consuming fire ignited later, in the narrow streets of Paris, when his cold-blooded volley of grape shot at point-blank range dispersed the enraged royalist crowd, saving the Directory. On this day, it became crystal clear. A new force had appeared in the country, one that could not be ignored. A general, not yet 30 years old, decisively took fate by the throat. However, external success was only the shining tip of the iceberg. Behind the rapid ascent lay a complex chess game played out on the map of Europe. Italy, fragmented into many small states, yet fabulously rich, became his first true proving ground. The army entrusted to him more resembled a gathering of vagrants and robbers, hungry, undressed, barefoot, demoralized men who had not been paid for a long time. Another commander would have fallen into despair, but Bonaparte saw in this a unique resource. He addressed them not as subordinates, but as free comrades, promising them honor, glory, and the untold riches of the fertile plains of Lombardy. And he kept his word. The Italian campaign overturned all academic notions of military art. Napoleon didn't just win, he changed the very philosophy of war. Instead of long, exhausting sieges and complex maneuvers, there were lightning-fast advances that left the enemy dizzy. Instead of linear tactics, there was extreme concentration of forces at one decisive point. He broke the superior Austrian forces piecemeal, appearing where he was least expected. The Battle of Arcole, the Battle of Rivoli. These names sounded like blows from a heavy hammer, destroying the old feudal order. All of Europe watched with amazement and fear as the young general dictated humiliating terms of peace to the ancient Habsburg Empire, hundreds of kilometers from Paris, and without asking permission from his government. But Napoleon's ambitions extended far beyond military victories. He perfectly understood one truth. Bayonets are good for conquering power, but they're uncomfortable to sit on. The country needed peace and stability, and he personally needed absolute, unlimited power. The coup of the 18th Brumaire was a masterpiece of political intrigue. Without much bloodshed, skillfully playing on the people's weariness of corruption, chaos, and uncertainty, he became first consul. Citizens, the revolution has exhausted itself. It has returned to its origins. It is finished. These words became an epitaph to the era of terror and the beginning of a new era, the era of the empire. Now his enemy was not only the external coalition of monarchs, but also internal anarchy. Napoleon took on the task of building the state with the same furious zeal with which he led regiments into a bayonet charge. He created a system that would outlive him for centuries. The Bank of France, the Legion of Honor, the network of lycées, the institution of prefects, the entire framework of modern France was forged precisely in these years of titanic labor. At the peak of his power, he faced an adversary that could not be defeated on the battlefield with cannons: his own legitimacy. To the hereditary monarchs of Europe, he was still a Corsican upstart, a usurper of the throne. To finally establish himself, he needed to become more than just a king. He needed a title that came from Rome, from Charlemagne himself. The coronation in Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2, 1804, became a grand apotheosis of this aspiration, the moment when he, breaking protocol, took the crown from the hands of the startled Pope and with his own firm hand placed it on his head, was a powerful symbol. His power was not from God, but from himself and from the will of the people. But behind the glitter of gold ermine and velvet, lay a deep personal drama. Josephine, his talisman, the woman he passionately loved despite all their quarrels, could not give him an heir. An emperor without a dynasty is a colossus with feet of clay, vulnerable to any shifting winds. The necessity of divorce and the search for a new wife, that womb that would continue his line, became his inner tragedy. His marriage to the Austrian princess Marie-Louise brought him into the family of ancient monarchs, legitimized his position, but fatally alienated him from the common people and the army. He was becoming part of that old world he had once come to destroy. The emperor's internal conflict was superimposed on a global philosophical confrontation. The Napoleonic Wars were not merely a struggle for territory or resources. It was a titanic clash of two worlds, the feudal past and the bourgeois future. The culmination of the external confrontation was the legendary Battle of Austerlitz. It was an absolute triumph of his genius. Early in the morning, when the cold winter sun dispelled the thick fog, Napoleon saw the Russian-Austrian troops descending from the Pratzen Heights, exposing their center, exactly as he had foreseen in his calculations. A swift strike at this vulnerable point split the Allied army in two and led to its complete defeat. Many enemy soldiers met their demise in the icy lakes. After this triumph, it seemed that there was no force in the world capable of stopping him. Proud Prussia was crushed in just a few weeks. Russia was forced to sign the Treaty of Tilsit. On a raft in the middle of the Neman River, two emperors divided the world like a pie. But this peace was only a temporary truce. The main irreconcilable enemy, Britain, remained out of reach beyond the waters of the English Channel. Unable to defeat the English fleet after the tragedy at Trafalgar, Napoleon decided to strangle the island economically. The Continental Blockade, a complete ban on trade with England for all of Europe, became his obsession. But economics is an element that does not obey orders like soldiers do. The blockade ruined ports, angered merchants, deprived people of familiar goods, and pushed allies towards betrayal. Russia, whose economy was critically dependent on English goods and exports, could not long tolerate these suffocating restrictions. A new conflict was inevitable. Napoleon's personal transformation by 1812 was evident even to his entourage. The flexible, sharp mind of General Bonaparte gave way to the heavy dogmatism of the emperor. He stopped listening to advisors, tolerated no objections. Belief in his lucky star grew into dangerous fatalism. The decision to invade Russia was made against logic, geography, and warnings. He assembled the largest army the world had ever seen, the Grand Army. More than 600,000 men, speaking 12 different languages, moved eastward. This was no longer the army of the French Revolution, united by a single patriotic impulse, but a gigantic, unwieldy war machine, driven by strict discipline and fear. The crossing of the Neman on June 24th was a magnificent, almost theatrical spectacle. But nature immediately gave an ominous sign, a sudden storm that broke out that day as if warning of the coming disaster. The Russian campaign, from the very beginning, did not unfold according to the emperor's script. Russian generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, instead of engaging in a general battle at the border and allowing themselves to be defeated, retreated, drawing the French deeper and deeper into the boundless, terrifying expanses. Space itself became a formidable weapon. Every step deeper into Russia stretched communications to their limit. Each day of the grueling march through heat and dust claimed thousands of lives of horses and men even before the first shot. Napoleon sought battle, He craved a, quote, zero to end the war with one powerful blow and dictate peace. And he got the Battle of Borodino. It was a clash of titans, a bloody meat grinder, where incredible transcendent courage was displayed by both sides. The French took positions, but the Russian army was not destroyed. It withdrew in an organized manner, maintaining its battle order. Kutuzov, that cunning old fox, understood a strategic truth inaccessible to the conqueror. To lose Moscow does not mean to lose Russia, and so we return to that moment on the Kremlin wall. The burning of Moscow became a turning point not only for the campaign, but for Napoleon's entire life. He waited for peace proposals for a whole month, sitting in the ruined, charred city amidst ashes and crows. But there was no answer from Tsar Alexander, only icy silence. The emperor found himself in a strategic trap. To go further to St. Petersburg? Impossible. Winter was already at the doorstep, and resources were depleted. To stay in Moscow for wintering? There was nothing to feed the huge army and horses. To retreat? This was tantamount to admitting complete defeat before all of Europe. He agonizingly delayed, and this delay proved fatal. The order to retreat was given too late. The terrible journey back along the old, already ravaged Smolensk road began. What followed is difficult to describe in words without an internal shudder. It was the slow, agonizing death of the Grand Army. General Frost, about whom historians so love to speak, did not enter the fray immediately, but when he struck, it was merciless. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Hungry, frost-bitten people turned into ghosts, wrapped in women's shawls, carpet scraps, and priestly vestments, trudged through the endless, snowy desert. Sudden Cossack raids gave no peace day or night, sowing panic. Discipline completely collapsed. Yesterday's victors, heroes of Europe, now fought each other for a piece of fallen horseflesh. The crossing of the Berezina River became the culmination of horror and, at the same time, of supreme heroism. French pontooniers, standing chest-deep in icy water, breaking the ice with their bodies, built bridges to save the remnants of the army. They knew it was their doom, but continued to work. Napoleon watched from the bank and, perhaps for the first time, clearly understood that his ambitions were paid for at too high, monstrous a price. Of more than 500,000 men who proudly entered Russia in the summer, only a miserable, broken tens of thousands crossed the Neman back. The Grand Army virtually ceased to exist. But even after such a crushing blow, Napoleon was not completely broken. His will to power was pathological. He abandoned the remnants of his troops and, incognito, rushed to Paris to assemble a new army of beardless youths. I grew up on the battlefield, and a man like me cares little for the death of 1,000,000 men, he allegedly threw in the face of Austrian diplomat Metternich. But Europe no longer feared him. The myth of his invincibility had been dispelled in the Russian snows. Prussia, Austria, Sweden raised their heads, sensing the scent of the wounded lion's blood. The War of the Sixth Coalition began. The grandiose quote won near Leipzig put an end to France's dominance. The betrayal of allies, the weariness and apathy of his own marshals, the complete exhaustion of human resources, all this led to the inevitable finale. Enemy troops entered Paris. The man who dreamed of uniting Europe now sat in an empty hall and signed the act of abdication in the palace of Fontainebleau. The attempt to voluntarily pass into oblivion with the help of the poison he had carried with him since the Russian campaign failed. The poison had lost its potency over the years, bringing only physical suffering, but not an end. fate denied him even this final outcome, preparing a different path. Exile to the small island of Elba seemed a cruel mockery. The ruler of the world became the emperor of a toy kingdom. But his active nature could not reconcile itself with the peace of a gardener. He eagerly followed the news from Vienna, where the victors were dividing Europe at the Congress and quarreling among themselves over territories. He knew that in France the Bourbon dynasty, which had returned in the wake of the Allied armies, had forgotten nothing and learned nothing, restoring the old order. Soldiers and peasants longed for their little corporal, for past glory, and he decided on a final, desperate adventure. The escape from Elba and landing in France with only a handful of loyal soldiers is one of the most fantastic stories in world history. "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, who among you wants to shoot your emperor? Shoot!" he shouts, flinging open his famous gray overcoat as government troops block his path. And the weapons drop. Cries of, "Long live the emperor!" thunder from the coast to Paris itself. It was the flight of an eagle, a triumphal march without a single shot. The 100 days of his second reign, that was the last bright flash of genius and despair. Everything was decided on the wet field of Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, it was as if nature itself had once again risen against him. Torrential rains had eroded the ground, turning the field into a swamp, preventing the artillery, his beloved god of war, from starting the battle on time and maneuvering. The English steadfastness of the Duke of Wellington and the timely appearance of Blucher's Prussians on the flank decided the outcome of the day. The old guard, the elite of elites, those very grumblers who had marched with him across all of Europe from Madrid to Moscow, perished in squares, refusing to surrender. "The guard dies, but does not surrender." These words, though attributed by legend, accurately reflected the spirit of that terrible day. The sun of Austerlitz set forever in clouds of gunpowder smoke. A second abdication, and now no Europe at all. The British would not risk it. The island of St. Helena, a lost, wind-swept piece of rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, became his prison and his mausoleum. 6 long years of slow decline under the petty, humiliating supervision of a jailer. But it was here, in exile, that Napoleon achieved his last, most important strategic victory. A victory over the memory of his descendants. Deprived of an army, a navy, and power, he took up the only remaining weapon, the pen. Dictating his memoirs, he masterfully created a legend of himself as a martyr, as a new Prometheus chained to a rock. He completely reinterpreted his actions, presenting himself as a defender of freedoms and a unifier of peoples, whose noble intentions were destroyed by reactionary monarchies. This memorial of St. Helena would become the true Bible of Bonapartism and ensure his immortality in the minds of future generations, transforming a tyrant into a romantic hero. On May 5, 1821, he passed away. His last words were an incoherent whisper, in which the main attachments of his life merged. France, army, vanguard, Josephine, the restless soul that had reshaped the world finally left it. But the powerful resonance of his life continues to vibrate even today, centuries later. The lessons of the Napoleonic era are universal and frighteningly relevant for any time. The first lesson is about the nature of power and human ambition. Napoleon clearly showed that one man, possessing exceptional will, energy, and intellect, can change the course of history, shifting the tectonic plates of civilization. Meritocracy, the principle according to which a person is judged and elevated by their abilities, not by nobility of birth, became the norm of the modern world, largely thanks to him. We live in a legal framework whose foundation is the Napoleonic Code. The concept of civil marriage, equality of all before the law, protection of private property, all this is the legacy of that turbulent era. However, the second lesson is a formidable warning. Bonaparte's story is a classic ancient tragedy of hubris, of excessive pride. Confidence in one's own infallibility, detachment from reality, and disregard for the human cost of success inevitably lead to catastrophe. When a leader begins to believe that he is the state, that his desires are above the laws of nature and society, the end is always the same, be it burning Moscow or a lonely rock in the ocean. The idea of forcibly uniting Europe failed, proving that a solid union cannot be built on coercion and fear. The national consciousness that he unwittingly awakened in the Germans, Italians, Russians, and Spanish proved stronger than any imperial idea. The third layer is the eternal paradox of freedom and order. Napoleon came to power under the slogans of saving the revolution, but ultimately usurped its fruits. He showed the whole world how easily and imperceptibly democracy can degenerate into a harsh dictatorship under the pretext of protecting the security and stability of the state. This mechanism of power transformation remains one of the most important and disturbing political lessons for any society. How to find that fragile balance between a strong hand, necessary in times of crisis, and the preservation of civil liberties. This question, sharply posed by the Napoleonic era, resonates even in the 21st century. Concluding this look at the life of the great Corsican, we return again to the image of fire. The fire of his incredible ambitions burned old Europe to the ground, clearing the way for the construction of a new one. The fire of Moscow became the tragic limit of these ambitions, and the quiet, trembling flame of a candle on the island of St. Helena, by the light of which memoirs were written, illuminated his image for posterity in a new light. Who was he? A monster who destroyed millions of lives for personal glory? Or a misunderstood genius who accelerated human progress and broke the rusty shackles of feudalism? The truth, as is often the case, does not lie in the middle. It is voluminous and includes both of these facets. He was a man who dared to challenge fate and almost defeated it, and even losing in the end, he left behind a world that could never be the same again. His gigantic shadow still falls on Europe, reminding us of the greatness of the human spirit and the terrible price that must be paid for attempting to become equal to the gods. History does not judge, it remembers, and the name of Napoleon Bonaparte is carved into its memory so deeply that no winds of time can erase it. Ultimately, his life is an eternal proof that the impossible becomes possible if one has the audacity to desire it with all one's soul.